A few weeks ago, I published a small paper on this, and I'll attempt, within the framework of this presentation, to submit to you the highlights thereof. In the spring of 2018, the revolutionary movement agenda in Armenia needs to be understood. To do it, we need to look at the sources thereof. On the one hand, one needs to find out who were the masterminds of this event and the social forces behind it. On the other hand, it's no less important to look at the ideology, the narratives and discourses, as well as the language used by the old and new political forces in this context. Nikol Pashinyan and his Civic Accord party essentially have made multiple statements about considering secondary any political ideology, focusing rather on challenges. That is, eradicating corruption, establishment of rule of law, free market competition. In the initial stage, such ideological indeterminacy may have contributed to this movement being more inclusive, but in the future this may pose certain dangers. So what is the ideology of the revolutionary agenda? What will the nation army or neoliberal ideology be replaced with? According to Mikos Poulantzas, it's common knowledge that the state cannot operate in isolation from the society. It is the material concentration of the existing social relations. In this respect, the previous Republican governments have created a prevailing traditional practice and language-based staunch system, which at the same time was acceptable for the external world. This system had two pillars. One was neoliberal trajectory for international structures consumption. The other one was nationalistic, military patriotic for the lower masses and classes in order for the economic policy and its disenfranchisement processes to meet as little resistance as possible. So the nation army motto was the roof over the neoliberal structure. If this roof were to be neutralized, the new authorities can only stay afloat hooking up to this neoliberal superstructure, which for the broad masses may even be deemed to be less legitimate unless it's replaced by, let's say, a new policy based on social justice. Quite naturally, the temptation to use the resources of the previous authorities is very high. The most controversial here is the nationalistic discourse, which during the revolution was juxtaposed by the civic self-organization and solidarity discourse. Nikol Pashinyan confrontation with the Armenian Republican Party had the purpose of bringing Pashinyan's rhetoric into the framework of the previous discourse. And Pashinyan, with some exceptions, has succeeded to duck this so far. A silent example is, for example, the May 28 Sardarabat celebrations, during which the substance and the content of the concert that was organized by the bygones and the difference of his statement on that background. So what are the differences between the bygones and the perceptions of the new ones? The new government has a certain distrust towards the agenda nation army. This was expressed, for example, by the new National Security Council Secretary Armen Grigoryan and his debate or correspondence between him and the former Minister of Defense. One may say that the differences between these two positions boils down to free and fair elections, reducing corruption, protecting human rights, and creating a competitive market. The motto of the revolution is also remarkable, which was proclaimed as following: love and solidarity. The word solidarity sometimes, especially by the bygones over these last weeks, was mistakenly used in their public statements or intentionally replaced by tolerance. But there is a significant difference here, because tolerate is one way of non-involvement, whereas solidarity assumes a share of social responsibility. Let's look at what were the locomotives of the revolution and the factors of the new agenda. This Armenian revolution being, since 2008, for the last decade, the quantitative and qualitative epitome of the popular movement, reflects also the counteraction of these political forces to the privatization, liberalization, and deregulation of the past 30 years. The Terut, Terchkan Waterfall, Mashtots Groove, 100 Drums, DMM, Electric Yerevan, and other civil initiatives in their agenda had the axis of social justice policy idea. In the event of Terut, it was squandering the national wealth and fair disposition of the resources. In other cases, it was protection of public areas or fair tariffs for public services, or prevention of privatization of the pension system, or precluding the super profits in the public area, or educational agenda. Let's now reflect on March-April events of 2018 and the active players therein. The movement was replete with baseline grassroots democracy elements. Rapidly mobilized masses, self-organization of groups, participatory decision-making. These groups, first and foremost, were groups of students, self-organized groups of students, which were the cultural axis of the movement. At the same time, they were not constrained by patriarchal or state structures or leverage. Another important stratum of the revolutionary wave was the fragments that were left after the numerous civic initiatives. They communicated with the civic contract party of Pashinyan. They also had sporadic expressions. There were lots of leftist, feminist, social liberal groups and cells, human rights organizations, and critical individuals who, opposing the traditional culture, reverted to practice during street actions that aimed to question the existing stereotypes and break the hierarchical structures. These were also the forerunners of a cultural revolution. Quite naturally, the middle class was also mobilized, especially SME representatives, who were no longer able to work in the old ways. Let's not forget that the revolution was made possible by the hundreds of thousands of people who converged on the movement from the provinces and the outskirts of Yerevan on the eve of Sargsyan resignation. These were the main victims of disenfranchisement and deprivation of the suffrage. So if we look at the decisive participation of the low classes in the revolution, then it's obvious that a particular dimension had to prevail in the agenda of the revolution. That is a more social or center-left economic policy. The linkage of the agenda of the revolution matters also in the context of globally prevailing discourses. What's this environment? From early 90s, neoliberal economic policy has rooted in Armenia in a kind of a hegemony. Within this period, everyone was speaking about the need to form a social agenda, and whoever ventured to do this was labeled as a populist. In the past, there was this prevailing ideology that came about according to which inequality is an acceptable state of the society. This old economic policy could only be replaced by the new one if you overcome both the internal resistance as well as external resistance thereto, for example, by the World Bank, the IMF, the Eurasian Economic Union, and other international entities and IFIs with their own agendas that are being imposed. Today, in the Armenia's economic discussions, the neoliberalism of the 90s still prevails with its narrative, which throughout the world are being critically reviewed as we speak. What are the prevailing discourses in the international scene? First and foremost, it's removing the impediments to free movement of capital, liberalization, deregulation, and privatization agenda. The second is the new constitutionalism processes, such as it's described by Stephen Gill, which enshrines capitalism through constitutional provisions. It assumes the shrinking of constitutionally enshrined rights and making them more relative. For example, the 2015 amendments to the Armenian constitution not only changed the system of governance, but also essentially lowered some social and other rights. And the third prevailing trend, which is closely related to the previous one and today, was already referred to by Mr. Zolyan, it's the post-democracy. According to Crowley Church, elections without democracy is what it hinges on. When a figment of democratic governance is set forth, but in the material domain, essentially the people is deprived of any power. In other words, the economy is immune to political decision making. There is also another global discourse concurrent to this, which is social justice and economic democracy discourse. This becomes ever more topical throughout the world in view of the crisis of traditional economic approaches. And in every, even industrialized country, there is deepening social polarization that's getting more acute. So let's get back to Armenia. In Armenia, the new agenda hinges over financial and resource redistribution for the sake of social fairness, equal opportunities, and economic democracy. The Nikol Pashinyan's party, in order to overcome the resistance mentioned above, needs to lean on a broad social base and lean on a pillar. The power to bring forth new political center should not only represent the middle class, the students, the progressive civic groups, but also the rural population, impoverished rural population of the provinces and the working class of Yerevan suburbs. So the expectation is that they should bring to life the main motto set forth by the revolution, love and solidarity. That is, this may only be leaning on a large coalition that would bring together the middle class and the impoverished broad masses. This is what may Mikaim, the uniting, bring together people not under the motto of the militant nation army motto based on xenophobic sentiment, but rather some positive values, that is individual freedoms and the public good, as well as fair disposition thereof. Usually the so-called democratic parties representing a broad spectrum of the population have inside of them different wings or factions, which, although united around the axis of main ideological premises, come up with left or right wings within. It's very important for these wings not to evolve around individuals, but rather ideological poles. To strengthen the base of the revolution, the best solution may be Nikol Pashinyan's. If the Nikol Pashinyan's party could have these three ramifications: the liberal wing, which already ostensibly exists within their party. It will bring together the Yelk Alliance, liberal, social liberal constituents, centripetal one comprising conservative democratic powers that could assume the role of intermediaries, and center-left wing comprising broad masses and their social agenda, and leftist civic groups that played a role in the revolution. Let's conclude. Supranational or diaspora capital should have conducive constitutional and legal framework, and provided that happens, large-scale investment will flow into Armenia, but without the change of political course, that would never result in breakthrough social developments, which were proclaimed as one of the objectives of the revolution. Moreover, this may result in new inequalities and conflicts. Decentralization of governance without coming up with investment resources for the communities and new ways of organization of communities will yield little to the provinces. So, without overcoming nationalistic or neoliberal narratives, the new political power may face social polarization and increased schism that may lead to the threat of new social explosion. One of the applied forms of new social agenda could be promoting new ways of community organization, applying the principle of fairness to the education system, economic democracy, and revaluation of the public domain. Thank you for your attention.